The Galactic Council Chamber was a cathedral of cold authority, its vast marble-white walls towering over the gathered representatives of 100 species. The air hummed with the quiet menace of unspoken judgments, punctuated by the murmurs of diplomats who spoke in hushed, clicking tongues. At the heart of the chamber, beneath the towering gaze of the High Chancellor, stood the human delegate, Commander Elias Voss. Voss was motionless, his presence an anomaly in a room designed to unsettle. His steel-gray eyes scanned the assembled dignitaries without the slightest flicker of intimidation. He had the look of a man who had long since shed the burden of fear. The tailored lines of his formal diplomatic uniform did little to conceal the quiet menace in his posture, the coiled restraint of someone who had spent a lifetime in the service of war. The High Chancellor, a towering figure of obsidian-hued flesh and sweeping robes, leaned forward from his elevated throne. His elongated fingers steepled before him as he studied the human before him with an expression of thinly veiled contempt. His voice, when it came, was a measured thing, smooth as oil over steel. Commander Voss, the Galactic Council convenes under the weight of grave accusations. The Terran Union stands accused of orchestrating the destruction of the Zarnathi supply fleet. Do you deny this act of aggression? The statement was a formality. The verdict had already been decided. Voss tilted his head, considering. His expression was unreadable, save for the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth. With all due respect, High Chancellor, the premise of your question is flawed. You assume guilt before establishing fact. A ripple of discontent coursed through the chamber. A squat, thick-shelled representative of the Voric Empire let out a hissing chuff. Do not play games with us. Human! The evidence is overwhelming. Human weapons, human tactics. A Terran warship was detected in the sector not 3 cycles prior to the attack. Voss did not flinch. Circumstantial. A ship's presence in a sector does not equate to guilt. By that logic, half the species in this room would be complicit in a dozen atrocities. The High Chancellor's fingers flexed, impatience flickering across his otherwise unshaken exterior. You come here under the banner of diplomacy, yet your words carry the tone of defiance. Voss exhaled slowly, as if reining himself in. I came here seeking truth. If the Council is interested in more than a show trial, I would be happy to assist in uncovering the real perpetrators. A deep, guttural growl filled the chamber, and General Codename, military commander of the Zarnathi, stepped forward. His hulking, armored frame bristled with latent aggression. His kind had never taken kindly to restraint, and the fact that he had been forced to endure human insolence in a setting that denied him the use of his claws was clearly grating on him. The truth, Codename snarled, is that humans are a species of killers hiding behind a veil of civility. You speak of peace, yet your history is one of blood and conquest. Voss's gaze met Codename's unflinchingly. Perhaps, but if you truly understood human nature, you'd know that we are far more dangerous when we do seek peace. The silence that followed was razor-sharp. The High Chancellor's dark gaze flickered between them before he leaned back, fingers tapping idly against his armrest. It is the Council's determination that you be detained for further questioning. Given the gravity of the charges, diplomatic immunity is hereby revoked. Guards. At once, a dozen heavily armed soldiers stepped forward, forming a semicircle around the human. Energy rifles snapped into readiness, their barrels glowing faintly with charged plasma. Voss did not move. His expression remained unchanged, though there was something in the way he held himself. Something that sent an unspoken warning through the chamber. He let the moment stretch, let the weight of the decision settle over the Council. And then, slowly, he exhaled, raising his hands just enough to convey compliance. The guards advanced. Voss allowed them to seize him, their grips firm but hesitant. They were wary, even now, even surrounded by overwhelming force. He saw in their eyes. They did not understand why. They did not have the words for it. But some primal part of them recognized the wrongness of this moment. They had just made a mistake. And Elias Voss, diplomat of the Terran Union, let them. The corridor to the detention wing was silent save for the rhythmic clank of armored boots against the polished floor. The guards moved in a disciplined formation, their weapons trained on the human, at the center of their ranks. Elias Voss walked with them, neither resisting nor speaking. His expression remained neutral, his hands loosely shackled in front of him. He had been in enemy hands before. He knew how this would play out. The door to the interrogation chamber slid open with a mechanical hiss. The room was sterile, its walls smooth and metallic, illuminated by a single overhead light that cast elongated shadows. A restraint chair sat bolted to the floor, its cuffs gleaming under the cold glow. Without prompting, Voss took his seat. The guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances before securing his wrists and ankles to the metal frame. Their hands lingered longer than necessary, as if expecting resistance. None came. The first to enter was High Chancellor Zaltor, his dark robes trailing behind him like liquid shadow. His expression was unreadable, but the slight narrowing of his elongated eyes betrayed his distaste. Behind him came General Korodych, his massive frame barely fitting through the doorway. The Zarnathi warrior's breathing was heavy, his sharp-toothed maw set in a permanent sneer. His claws flexed in frustration, betraying his eagerness for something more violent. "You disappoint me, Commander Voss," the High Chancellor began, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I had hoped your people would embrace diplomacy. Yet here you are, the very embodiment of defiance." Voss met his gaze with the calm indifference of a man entirely in control of himself. "Diplomacy requires mutual respect. So far, I've only seen a well-rehearsed performance." Korodych stepped forward, his armored footfalls heavy against the floor. "You mock us even now?" His voice was a low growl. "We have evidence. We have motive. Your people—" "My people had no involvement." Voss's tone was even, but something in the way he spoke the words made the room feel smaller. Korodych's nostrils flared. "Lies!" Zaltor held up a hand, silencing the general before regarding Voss with cool scrutiny. "We are beyond negotiations, Commander. This is not a trial. It is an interrogation." A faint smirk touched Voss's lips. "Then ask your questions." The High Chancellor studied him for a moment longer before stepping back, allowing Korodych to take over. The Zarnathi warrior moved to a control panel embedded in the wall and pressed a sequence of keys. A sharp, pulsing hum filled the chamber as the restraints emitted a faint, shimmering energy field. It wasn't painful, not yet, but Voss recognized the technology. Neural destabilizers. A crude but effective means of breaking prisoners. "We know humans hide their true military strength," Korodych said, watching Voss carefully. "We know you are not as weak as you pretend to be." He paced in slow, deliberate strides. "Your forces are smaller, yet your wars are devastating. Your species fights like a predator cornered, striking with a brutality that should not belong to such a young race." Voss remained silent. Korodych's claws clicked against the metal console. "Tell me, Commander, what is your true rank?" The question was expected. Voss tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words. "You already know. Diplomatic envoy of the Terran Union." A sharp jolt coursed through his restraints. It was subtle, a warning rather than a punishment, but the underlying threat was clear. Korodych leaned closer. "Do not insult me. We have gathered records." The name Elias Voss is linked to classified operations, to conflicts that ended too cleanly, too decisively. His voice was almost reverent now. "The humans call you something else, don't they?" For the first time, Voss's expression changed. It was slight, barely perceptible, but Korodych saw it. A flicker of something restrained. "You have no idea what you're asking," Voss said quietly. Korodych bared his teeth in something between a snarl and a grin. "Ah, so there is something to ask." Zaltor observed the exchange with interest. "There are whispers among our intelligence circles. Commander, a name, a myth, a human designation feared even among the most ruthless species in this galaxy." He took a slow step forward. "Tell me, what does Baba Yaga mean?" The air in the room shifted. The guards stiffened, though none of them could explain why. The hum of the restraints seemed louder. Voss's gaze was unreadable. He let the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to settle before speaking. "It means you should have left me alone." The words landed heavier than they should have, as if carrying a weight beyond their simplicity. Korodych's smirk faltered. Zaltor, for all his composure, hesitated. Voss exhaled slowly, his expression calm once more. You think humans are monsters. He shook his head slightly. You have no idea what real monsters look like. Zaltor's fingers twitched against his robe. Corey claws flexed again, but this time there was no aggression in the movement, only uncertainty. You're bluffing, Corey muttered, but the words lacked conviction. Voss didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence did the work for him. The High Chancellor turned abruptly, his robes billowing as he moved toward the exit. We are done here. His voice was sharp, but there was something unsteady beneath it. General, prepare a full military tribunal. If the Terran Union will not answer for their crimes, they will suffer the consequences. Core ADH lingered a moment longer, studying Voss as if trying to peel back the layers of the man before him. Then, with a low grunt, he followed Zaltor out. The guards hesitated before disengaging the restraints. None of them met Voss's eyes as they pulled him to his feet and led him away. They didn't understand what had changed, but they could feel it. The chamber was no longer filled with arrogance. The whispers had spread like wildfire, infecting even the most skeptical members of the Galactic Council. What had begun as a routine interrogation had shifted into something else. Something colder, something that left a weight in the air that no one could name. High Chancellor Zaltor sat in silence at the head of the council, his fingers steepled before him, his expression carefully measured. Across the hall, General Kordich had not spoken since their return. The Zarnathi warrior, once so certain of human frailty, now stared at nothing, his jaw clenched tight. The other delegates were restless. Some muttered among themselves in their own tongues, uneasy glances flickering toward one another. Others simply sat rigid, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the silence. It was Lieutenant Arhen, the youngest intelligence officer in the chamber, who finally found his voice. His kind were scholars, archivists of war. He had spent years dissecting human conflicts, searching for patterns in their madness. But nothing had prepared him for this. The name, he said, his voice just above a whisper. It is not unknown to us. All eyes turned to him. Koryach's gaze sharpened, his usual impatience tempered by something quieter, something bordering on concern. Zaltor merely tilted his head, waiting. Arhen's hands trembled as he sifted to the datapad before him, pulling up fragmented reports, classified intelligence, rumors whispered on the edges of dying battlefields. The humans do not speak of it openly, he continued. It is not an official rank, not a formal designation. It is the Spectre. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. A title given to something beyond soldiers, beyond war itself. They call it Baba Yaga. The name seemed to darken the very air of the chamber. Even those unfamiliar with human languages could feel the weight of it. It carried no direct translation, but its meaning was clear in the way Arhen's voice wavered. Koryach, always a skeptic, exhaled sharply through his nostrils. A ghost story, he muttered. Humans and their endless myths. But there was no certainty behind his dismissal. Arhen's fingers tightened around the datapad. Is it? His voice was barely restrained. The records show otherwise. Entire conflicts ended in a single night. Enemy leadership eliminated with surgical precision. War fronts shifting in ways that defied logic, as if entire strategies were rewritten by an unseen hand. His gaze flicked to the High Chancellor, and in every instance, buried beneath layers of redacted reports, one phrase repeats. He turned the datapad outward, displaying the translated text on the chamber's central holo display. Baba Yaga engaged. No survivors. The silence stretched. Zaltor studied the data, his expression betraying nothing. But in the way his fingers flexed, the way his breathing had slowed, it was clear he understood the gravity of what lay before them. Koryach, ever the warrior, leaned forward. You're suggesting, he said carefully, that the human we just interrogated is him? Arhen hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Commander Elias Voss. Special Forces. His records are fragmented. Entire portions of his service history classified beyond even our highest intelligence access. What is available suggests a career that does not align with a simple diplomat. His voice turned hollow. There is no proof, but there is enough to be afraid. The words settled like a weight over the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Core ADH did something uncharacteristic. He laughed. It was short, sharp, the sound of man grasping at anything to anchor himself. Even if the rumors were true, even if this human was more than he claims to be, we have him in our custody. His claws flexed against a metal table. I could rip his throat out before he took another breath. Hen's stare was cold. And if you are wrong, for the first time in his life, Core ADH had no response. Zaltor exhaled slowly, his unreadable gaze turning inward, weighing possibilities against dangers that had not existed mere hours ago. He had lived through 3 planetary conflicts, had stood before empires on the verge of collapse, had witnessed the raw fury of war in its most unfiltered form. But now, sitting in the heart of the most powerful council in the galaxy, he felt something he had not felt in centuries. Doubt. The human had not resisted. He had not fought against his captors, had not raised his voice in anger or defiance. He had let himself be taken. Zaltor's gaze shifted to the security monitors displaying a holding cell. Voss sat on the metal bench, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He looked like a man waiting for something. Not a prisoner. Not a diplomat caught in a political storm. Just waiting. Zaltor did not believe in myths. But as he watched the humans sit in silence, unmoved by the weight of the galaxy's judgment, he realized something terrifying. Perhaps the myths believed in him. The cell was quiet, not the silence of captivity, but the silence of something far worse, something waiting, something inevitable. The guard stationed outside the reinforced door shifted uneasily, their grips tightening on their weapons. None of them spoke. None of them looked at the monitor displaying the human within. Elias Voss sat motionless, his head tilted slightly downward, eyes half-lidded as if resting. His hands, unbound now, rested loosely on his knees. His breathing was even measured, not resigned, not anxious, just calm. That was what unsettled him most. When the door finally hissed open, it wasn't a guard who entered. High Chancellor Zaltor stepped forward, his black robes trailing behind him like liquid night, his expression impassive. Behind him, General Core ADH loomed, his armored form tense with barely restrained energy. The two stood before Voss, but he did not acknowledge them, did not lift his head. Zaltor clasped his hands before him. We have been discussing you, Commander. Voss did not move. The High Chancellor continued. There are concerns. His tone was measured, a man carefully navigating a battlefield of words. Our council has fought wars for centuries. We understand soldiers. We understand killers. But you are something else, aren't you? Voss exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against his knee, before finally lifting his gaze. You're afraid. Core ADH snarled, stepping forward. We do not fear humans. Voss's expression didn't change. His voice remained quiet. Steady. Yes, you do. Zaltor's fingers twitched. Is it true, he asked. The name, the legend, Baba Yaga. For a moment, there was nothing. Then finally, Voss smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. You shouldn't have said out loud. Core ADH moved first, a blur of motion, his claws swiping for Voss's throat. A single instant, a heartbeat of violence. And then Core ADH was on the floor, choking on his own breath. Voss hadn't appeared to move. Not at first. But now he was standing, the shift so fluid it seemed unnatural. His boot pressed against Core ADH's throat, his fingers tightening around Zarnathi's wrists. Twisted at an angle that should not be possible. The guards outside surged forward, weapons raised, but Voss's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Don't. They froze. They didn't know why. They just did. Core ADH struggled, his massive frame thrashing, but it was useless. The pressure at his throat was precise, calculated. Not enough to kill. Not yet. Zaltor did not move, though his face betrayed something close to astonishment. This is not. Voss's eyes flicked to him, and the High Chancellor's words died in his throat. It wasn't just a glare. It was something else. A depth of cold calculation that should not exist in a diplomat. Voss exhaled sharply, almost disappointed, and released his grip. Core ADH gasped, rolling to his side, hacking for air. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to act. Voss adjusted his cuffs, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off something dull and uninteresting. You wanted to know, he murmured. Now you do. Zaltor's voice was quiet. The stories are true, then. Voss didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands for a long moment before exhaling. You asked the wrong question. The High Chancellor's brow furrowed. Then what is the right one? Voss's gaze lifted, and for the first time, they saw it. Not the man, not the diplomat, not even the soldier. The thing beneath. The question is what I am. His voice was soft, almost conversational. It's how many of me are out there. The silence that followed was absolute.